Have you ever worked so hard for something only to watch someone else get rewarded for your effort? I have, and not just anyone. The kind who strolls in late, leaves early, and somehow always ends up in the spotlight. If you've ever sat quietly in a meeting while someone else presented your ideas as their own, or stayed up rewriting someone else's mess just to save a project, then you probably know how this starts. But stay with me, because this one doesn't end with revenge. It ends with clarity. And a final line that changed everything. So if you're watching this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels, and if something in you recognizes something in this, stay with me. My name is Lauren Reed, and for 5 years I worked as a senior campaign strategist at Apex Media. I started when the company was in a transition phase, shifting leadership, refining identity, chasing relevance. In that constant motion, I carved out something steady. I became the person who stayed late when deadlines tightened, who handled the client calls no one wanted, who read every footnote before signing off. I never announced those things. I assumed the results would speak for themselves. Sandra Green, our senior director, was one of the few who noticed. She had a calm kind of authority, measured, instinctively respected. 2 months before she planned to retire, she asked me to walk with her after a quarterly review. I still remember the weather that day. Overcast, early spring, the kind that makes everything feel suspended. She told me she had already spoken with executive leadership, that she had named me as the person who should take her place. I said thank you, but not out of surprise. I had been preparing for that moment long before it arrived. What followed was not ambition, it was alignment. I rebuilt my strategic roadmap, restructured timelines on 2 major accounts, took additional training in predictive analytics, and refined my presentation until it could withstand every question I had ever seen a room ask. I did not campaign. I did not politic. I simply worked. When people asked if I was nervous, I told them no. What I felt was quiet conviction. The announcement was scheduled for a Friday morning at 9 a.m. I arrived nearly 2 hours early, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because that day mattered. I reviewed the department transition plan I had outlined and mentally rehearsed the remarks I expected to give. I wore charcoal gray and a watch I had not taken out in months. It had been a gift from my father after graduate school, and it felt appropriate to wear it now. As the room filled, Sandra offered me a brief, affirming glance. Across from me, Brian Harper adjusted the cuffs on his shirt. He was newer than I was, had joined the company 2 years after me, and though our roles were technically parallel, our approaches never were. Where I worked behind the scenes, Brian floated, charming, casually present when it counted, absent when it didn't. I had covered for him more than once, but never complained. At the time, I thought doing the work well mattered more than being seen doing it. When David Lin, our vice president of marketing, walked in with Margaret Chen, the chief executive officer, something shifted. The presence of the chief executive suggested a broader intention, a decision larger than a departmental change. I kept my hands still on the table. My notes remained folded in front of me, unopened. David began with a tribute to Sandra, thanking her for her leadership and consistency over the years. Then he paused, and when he resumed, he said the words I still recall in sequence, though not with feeling. We are pleased to announce that Brian Harper will step into the role of Senior Strategy Director, effective immediately. There was applause. It lasted longer than necessary. I joined in, once, twice, then let my hands rest again. Across the table, Brian rose and made a modest show of humility. He thanked the leadership team, then turned and looked directly at me. Lauren, he said, your insight and structure have always grounded this team. I'll be relying on you more than ever. He smiled, not kindly, but with something practiced. The room reacted with nods and polite murmurs. No one noticed I had not said anything. When the meeting ended, people returned to their desks. A few stopped by mine, some out of sympathy, others out of obligation. They offered a hand on my shoulder, a quiet, next time, or something about how unexpected it all was. I nodded, made eye contact, said thank you, and resumed typing. What I typed did not matter. What I did next did. I created a new document on my desktop. I titled it simply, Transition Notes, Unofficial. I did not explain the title. I did not mark it with anything obvious. It would have looked like just another report. Inside it, I wrote the first sentence without pausing. Brian Harper appointed to Senior Strategy Director announcement made 9:03 a.m. That was all for the moment, but I let the cursor blink for several minutes after. Not because I did not know what to say next, but because for the first time in years, I realized no one would be asking me what I thought, and that was going to be their first mistake. By Monday morning, the rhythm of the office had already shifted. There was no formal announcement, no welcome email, just a quiet rearrangement of names and responsibilities that made it clear who now held the title. Brian's name appeared first on the team schedule, and Sandra's former office, once grounded in spare, now had its walls filled with his framed certificates and sports memorabilia. People walked past it differently. Some peered in with polite curiosity. Others lingered longer, measuring how the air had changed. Our weekly team call opened without hesitation. Brian took the lead naturally, as if he had always been in that seat. When he turned to me, it was with an open palm and an easy voice. "Lauren, would you walk us through the performance projections for Q2? I did what was asked, clear and concise. He nodded, thanked me, and moved on. My name wasn't mentioned again. It was a clean handoff, one that made the work visible while erasing the person behind it. Later that day, he forwarded me a presentation deck for client review. As I opened the file, it took only seconds to recognize the structure. It was mine. The outline, the phrasing, even the slide transitions followed the exact sequence I had built the week before, only the header had been changed. His name now appeared as the author. I stared at it for a long moment, then closed it and reopened the version I had saved on my own drive. Unaltered, time-stamped. I replied with the updated formatting he had asked for, made no mention of the origin, and saved the interaction in silence. The rest of the week followed the same cadence. I was still doing the work, but the spotlight had shifted. My role had become quiet, almost peripheral. Conversations I used to lead now happened outside my line of sight. People I had mentored no longer came to me with questions, at least not publicly. When they did approach, it was in lowered voices, or when no one else was nearby. I answered with the same focus as before, but I began keeping my own record, of versions, of timing, of where credits landed and where they did not. On Thursday evening, Sandra called. She had heard about the transition, though not the details. Her voice was calm, but beneath it I sensed the restraint of someone who had learned to pick her battles. She told me she had done what she could, that she was sorry, even if she hadn't said it aloud the day it happened. I told her there was no apology needed. I meant it. This wasn't her mess to clean. Friday ended as quietly as it began. As I stepped into the elevator to head home, Brian joined me. He stood to the side, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed. "No hard feelings, I hope," he said after a beat. "It's never personal, these things. Timing, fit, the way decisions look from the top." I met his reflection in the elevator door, not his eyes. "Of course," I said evenly. "That makes sense." He smiled, but only faintly. The kind of smile meant to look effortless, but sharpened by the presence of doubt. Neither of us spoke again. When we reached the lobby, he stepped out first without turning back. I walked behind him, my steps unhurried, letting the sound of the city ease back in as the doors closed behind us. I did not feel erased. I felt precise. Quiet, yes, but deliberate. Brian had stepped into the role, but I was still the one doing the work. And if he thought no one was watching, he had forgotten the one person who knew exactly where the lines had started. That was the second mistake, and I wrote it down. The week after Brian's promotion unfolded with quiet efficiency. Tasks were reassigned without fanfare. My name began to disappear from meeting agendas, even as my work remained embedded in every deliverable. No one explicitly removed me. They simply stopped including me. It was a slow redirection, less like being pushed out, more like being asked to fade politely. I kept moving. I still arrived early, responded to every client query, and ensured every campaign under my previous portfolio stayed on track. What changed wasn't the work. It was the way credit circulated. Brian began presenting internally as if the vision had always been his. His voice carried language I recognized from strategy documents I had authored months ago. Phrases I once used to describe future positioning came back to me repackaged, slightly altered, as if spoken for the first time. Each time it happened, I noted the date and context, not out of spite, but out of habit. I had always tracked details. The difference now is where I kept them. Clients who once requested me directly were now redirected to him. When they asked why I wasn't on calls, the answer was vague: restructuring, streamlining, realignment. One client even reached out to me through my personal number, confused after receiving a half-complete brief. I explained that I was no longer the lead, and they apologized awkwardly, as if they had uncovered something they were not supposed to see. The real change came when I lost access to our shared strategy archive. It happened without warning. One morning, I opened a folder I had built over 4 years, filled with case notes, timelines, performance reviews, and found it locked. No alert, no handover. I messaged systems support, and they replied with a generic explanation. The contents had been reallocated under new leadership. It was protocol, they said. Nothing personal. I did not protest. I did not escalate. But I knew what I had backed up. Quietly, over the years, I had built a local mirror of every framework I had created, every slide deck I had delivered, and every version of language that had been debated and finalized. It wasn't a safety net. It was how I worked. I never trusted the system to remember nuance. That choice, made out of discipline rather than suspicion, had now become essential. By Thursday, Brian had begun making structural changes to my remaining role. He shifted reporting lines, reassigned junior staff I had mentored, and absorbed the language of ownership without context. I watched the mechanics of his rise with clinical distance. It wasn't personal, not yet. It was a strategy of consolidation, standard for a system that rewards presence more than contribution. That evening, after most of the floor had cleared out, I walked past Sandra's old office, now his, and noticed the light still on. Brian was inside, alone, pacing while holding a printed report I recognized instantly. It was the campaign blueprint I had drafted in my final month under Sandra's guidance. He looked at it the way someone examines instructions they do not fully understand, but are unwilling to admit they need help with. I kept walking, not because I was being noble, but because I had no interest in rescuing someone who never acknowledged being carried. The next morning, I arrived to find my calendar empty. Not one meeting, not Eva. Fantiep Noiseo Part 4, *. The silence on my calendar was no longer an oversight, it became routine. I stopped receiving meeting invites, not abruptly, but like a faucet tightening slowly. The check-ins I once led continued without me. Clients were handed off without introduction. Projects still moved, but something in the rhythm had changed. No announcement marked my shift. No official update defined my new role. I had not been demoted. I had simply been repositioned into invisibility. I chose not to ask questions, not because I lacked the right, but because I already understood the answers. I knew how systems protect their narrative. A title is easier to defend than a pattern of contribution. What I had built still echoed through the work, but my name had been erased from its surface. I adjusted in silence. I arrived early, documented everything, and observed how Brian carried the pieces forward, badly. By midweek, signs of strain surfaced. A junior strategist tapped me on the shoulder after a team sync. Her voice lowered. The updated branding deck, was it supposed to have the customer insights from last quarter? I looked at her for a long moment. Yes, I said quietly. It was. I did not offer to fix it. I simply reopened my version that night, double-checked the original file, and noted the discrepancy. Not out of spite, out of habit. In one presentation, a projection slide had mislabeled baseline metrics, which led to a budget request that was off by 10%. No one noticed, at first, but one director paused mid-call and asked, "Wait, where did this data come from?" The room stilled. Brian fumbled an answer about the analytics team. I knew where the original figures had lived. They had been part of a report I authored 6 months earlier. That version was no longer on the server. A colleague from product strategy passed my desk the next morning with a hesitant question. "Do you know who handled the compliance checklist for last fall's rollout?" I turned slightly. "That was me, but I lost access after the transition." He nodded, mumbled something about redundancy, and walked off. I watched him disappear down the hallway. Another fragment, another small gap in the system's memory. Later that week, a longtime client called. Her tone was cordial but clipped. "I reviewed the latest proposal," she said. "It doesn't quite match the trajectory we discussed last year. Did something change?" I replied carefully, "I'm not assigned to that account anymore." There was a pause. "I see," she said, then thanked me and hung up. That evening I stayed behind. The office emptied slowly, leaving behind only light and the hum of air vents. As I gathered my things, the director of operations passed by. "Are you still in touch with Sandra?" he asked casually. "Yes," I replied. He hesitated. "Strange, some of her old documentation is missing. No backups, nothing in the archive." I nodded without comment. Some truths do not need witnesses. They only need to persist. I left the office that night aware of one thing: systems forget on purpose. They replace, overwrite, clean house. But not everything goes quietly. Not when someone still remembers which details matter. Not when the record lives elsewhere. Brian had taken the spotlight, but the structure he stood on had cracks, thin ones, nearly invisible, until someone asked the right question. And lately, they had started asking. By the start of the next week, the consequences of erasure were no longer confined to my desk. They leaked slowly but persistently into the work itself. What had once functioned with quiet precision began to stumble in small, almost unnoticeable ways. Deadlines missed by hours, a report misaligned with the client's timeline, feedback loops breaking where they had once held firm. No one pointed fingers yet, but more often people began asking, "Are we sure this is the right version?" I kept a steady pace, neither offering correction nor raising alarm. There was no satisfaction in watching things unravel, only a measured awareness that when a system forgets where it began, it struggles to find where it is going. In one team sync, someone mentioned a branding decision we had settled months earlier. Brian nodded confidently, then directed the group to a new summary that omitted the reasoning we had built over several iterations. No one contradicted him. But I saw the pause in one colleague's face, the flicker of recognition that something was missing, and no one was saying it out loud. Midweek, I was approached by a team lead from another department who quietly asked whether I still had the original version of a strategy framework. "We can't locate it," she said, keeping her voice low. "It used to live in the archive Sandra referenced." I told her I would check. I did not mention that I already knew it had been scrubbed during the transition. That night, I reopened my own files and confirmed the timestamp copy, intact and unedited. I did not send it, but I added another entry to my log: what had been asked, when and by whom. Things accelerated after that. A client flagged discrepancies between the proposal they were given and the metrics from our previous quarter. The gap wasn't wide, but it was enough to raise concern. They didn't request a correction. They simply asked what had changed. When Brian responded, his answer skirted around specifics, leaning heavily on strategic adjustments and shifting market conditions. But those phrases don't quiet unease. They sharpen it. Later that day, a senior associate stopped by my desk, ostensibly to ask about a formatting detail, but her real question came quietly. "Do you think the right people are making the final calls?" I did not answer directly. I only met her eyes and returned the question with a pause of my own. She nodded slowly and walked away. Brian's presence remained outwardly steady. He made more appearances, joined more meetings, and attached himself to every discussion with rehearsed familiarity. But I had begun to notice how often he asked others to resend files, how frequently he redirected questions rather than answered them, how his confidence had grown louder even as the work beneath it grew thinner. I made no effort to expose him. I corrected nothing. I simply ensured my records were clear and my responses exact. Because by now, the cracks were no longer subtle, and it was only a matter of time before someone followed one to its source. The breakdown did not begin with a scandal. It started with a hesitation, a pause in someone's sentence, a repeated check on a number that used to be certain. Horizon still functioned, but not smoothly. Reports contradicted each other. Files were duplicated or missing. Deadlines slipped, but no one could agree on who had moved them. I stayed quiet. I was not trying to reclaim anything, but when people came to my desk, they stopped asking casual questions. Now they asked, "Do you remember if we approved this version?" Or, "Was this the framework Sandra used?" I always answered with precision, never opinion. I left no trace of judgment in my tone, only clarity. One afternoon, a long-term client visited the office. She requested a meeting with Brian about strategy realignment. I was not included. From where I sat, I saw her expression tighten during their discussion. her brows drawn in, her arms crossed as she listened to his broad promises about upcoming campaigns. When she stood to leave, she passed by my desk, paused, and said, "Rachel, do you still have the roadmap from last year? The one we signed off with Sandra?" I said yes. That evening, I sent it. No commentary, no attachments beyond what she requested, but the timestamp spoke for itself. After that, more questions surfaced. A partner from operations asked whether I remembered the rationale behind a pivot in the fall campaign. The explanation Brian had given did not match what she recalled. When I showed her the original document, she read it twice. Then she said nothing and walked out of the room, holding the pages as if they weighed more than they should have. It was not me who brought doubt to the surface. It was the records that no longer matched the narrative. Brian continued to speak confidently in meetings, but more eyes drifted toward others when questions went unanswered. His name still carried weight, but it was no longer enough to hold the room when data points diverged. Eventually, the board requested a comprehensive review, not of Brian, not directly, but of departmental accuracy and record keeping. A familiar phrase returned: "We just want to understand what changed and when." They never said who, but they began circling the space he had tried to dominate. I did not offer to clarify. I did not correct anything. But I could feel it, an unspoken shift, as the organization began retracing its steps not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. When a system forgets its own foundation, it will return to whoever still remembers the map. There was something different in the way people spoke that week. Not louder, quieter, but the quiet had changed. It was no longer the silence of acceptance. It had become the silence of suspicion. You could hear it in the extra seconds people took before answering, in the shuffle of papers as colleagues searched for an earlier version to compare, in how no one trusted the most recent file without proof. One afternoon, a mid-level manager from finance sent me a message. She asked, politely, if I recalled who had built the original revenue model for the spring campaign. The question wasn't casual. Something in her phrasing hinted at numbers that no longer added up. I confirmed that the model had been mine and offered to share the early draft. After a moment's pause, she asked, did the assumptions change, or was it just rewritten? I told her I didn't know. That was true. No one had asked me since I'd been moved off the project. Later that week, in a department meeting, I watched a senior executive question Brian about the timeline of an upcoming launch. He responded with confidence, stating a new date. She frowned slightly, reached into her folder, and pulled out a printed copy from months earlier. "This version says something else," she said. "So which one are we going with?" Brian gave a small laugh, adjusted his tie, and tried to shift the conversation. But the air in the room had already changed. People no longer nodded just because he spoke. After the meeting, a colleague approached me near the elevator. "Do you still have that forecast deck Sandra used last year?" he asked, carefully casual. "I think the board is about to realize there are mismatches." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. I told him I'd look into it. And I did. The most telling signs weren't dramatic. They were systemic. Missing files stayed missing. Unanswered questions lingered in the air longer. The habit of smoothing over inconsistencies had vanished. Everyone seemed to be keeping their own copies now, quietly, like I had all those months ago. I didn't volunteer context. I didn't point fingers. But I saw the shift in posture, in tone, in where people now looked for certainty. The system had spent months rebuilding its surface, but now it had to face what it had paved over. If every version conflicted, they would soon have to ask, who had kept the one that matched reality, and whether they were ready to acknowledge the person they had once erased. It came quietly, like most things that matter. A long-standing client, seated across from the leadership team during what should have been a routine campaign review, tilted her head slightly at a chart that looked too polished. Her tone was calm. "Can I ask," she said, tapping the page, "who built this model?" Brian answered without pause. He said it had been refined by his team for clarity and alignment, but the client did not seem fully convinced. She leaned back and said, almost as an afterthought, "I remember something different. There was an earlier framework, before the transition. Wasn't it from Rachel?" She spoke my name without tension, just curiosity, like reaching for a familiar tool she once trusted. I wasn't in that room, but by the time I returned to my desk, two separate people had mentioned the moment to me. and I knew something had shifted. That one question changed the meeting. Not with outrage, but with focus. Laptops opened, folders were reopened that had not been touched in months. Files were cross-checked. And what emerged, slowly, was the shape of something real underneath the surface revisions. Dates, formats, the structure I had designed, hidden under new fonts and fresh covers, still intact, still speaking. Over the following days, I noticed things begin to unstick. Someone reprinted an early launch deck. A team lead asked to revisit a planning document from last quarter. One of them stopped me in the break room. "We found an old comparison sheet in your style," he said simply. "It matches what the vendor remembered, but not what Brian sent over." He did not elaborate. He just nodded once and walked away. The unraveling was not dramatic. It was steady. Strategic plans were now double-checked against archived versions. Notes from prior meetings circulated again unofficially. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. The system was trying to trace its way back to something credible. And that path was leading, repeatedly, to what I had once built and what someone else had tried to claim. Brian remained at the center, still performing leadership. But now, even his confidence felt rehearsed. When asked for details, he paused longer. When clients raised specifics, he deferred to team members. But most telling, what he said no longer held the final word. It was reviewed. It was cross-referenced. No one announced anything. No role was reassigned. But what Brian delivered was no longer called strategy. They had begun to call it what it was, a version. And that, quietly and completely, changed everything. By then, I had become a presence without posture, someone they did not fully include but no longer ignored. I still arrived early, still met my deadlines, still moved through the corridors like I always had. But the conversations around me had shifted. Fewer people looked to Brian for direction. More glanced toward me when clarity was needed. Not because I had spoken, but because something in the structure still responded to my touch. One morning, I overheard two department heads discussing a client account. Their tones were hushed, careful. "That roadmap from last year, Rachel still has it, right?" one asked. The other replied, "She does, and hers is the only one that still makes sense." They fell silent as I passed, pretending not to notice me, but the quiet was weighty. It no longer felt like exclusion. It felt like regret. There were now recurring requests for files I had archived, models I had refined, notes only I had kept. People began to tread carefully around those materials, as though touching them too boldly might reveal how much they had relied on someone who had no title left to justify her relevance. But the system, in its need to function, had begun to pull from the only source it could still trust. Brian, meanwhile, grew quieter. His answers turned vague. His attempts to lead meetings came with more slides and fewer specifics. He smiled more, but it reached fewer people. I noticed how often he repeated phrases from older campaigns, how often he attributed collaborative efforts to the team, though no one stepped forward to own them. I said nothing. I offered no correction, no assertion. But I kept responding with calm precision each time someone asked for context, not to prove a point, only because the questions deserved answers. It became clear that the vacuum left in the wake of my erasure had not been filled. It had simply been ignored. Until the silence became a liability. The work had outlived the politics. The record had remained, even when the storyteller had not been invited to speak. They never apologized. No one ever admitted fault. But in their return to my version of events, in their quiet reliance on what I had once structured, something more honest was revealed than any confession could offer. They had tried to remove me, but they could not remove the foundation, and now they had to rebuild on it, piece by piece, with or without permission. I never asked to return, and no one ever formally invited me. But in the final weeks before I left Horizon for good, the work began orbiting me again. Not out of recognition, but out of necessity. When a project needed course correction, they brought me in to consult. When a client grew uncertain, I was quietly copied on the notes. I responded precisely, sparingly. I did not revisit what had happened. I simply gave them the answers they no longer seemed able to find on their own. One of the newer associates once paused outside my door. She looked nervous, holding a file she had inherited mid-project. "I know this is not your responsibility anymore," she said, "but the handoff is unclear, and no one else seems to remember the rationale." I nodded and motioned her in. As I walked her through the structure, why it was built the way it was, what had shifted since, I saw her face change. It was not admiration, it was relief, not because I had solved something difficult, but because for a moment the ground felt solid beneath her again. Brian remained in his position, but he no longer carried it with the same assurance. His role had become ceremonial, present but not trusted. At meetings, people asked him fewer questions, and when they did, they often looked to others for confirmation before accepting his answers. He noticed, everyone did, but no one said anything. Because no one had to. Eventually, the chief executive officer stepped in to review internal alignment. That was the phrase used. There was no announcement, no accusation, just a shifting of layers, quietly, deliberately, until decisions were once again being made without him in the room. I submitted my resignation 2 weeks later, not as a final gesture, not to claim victory, simply because the story was no longer mine to carry. I had rebuilt what I could, made clear what needed to be seen. And now, the system would either learn to hold itself accountable or break under the weight of its own forgetting. Either way, my part was done and I left without looking back.